Section 1 of On Chronic Alcoholic Intoxication, with an inquiry into the influence of the abuse of alcohol as a predisposing cause of disease. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Curt, Walton. On Chronic Alcoholic Intoxication, with an inquiry into the influence of the abuse of alcohol as a predisposing cause of disease by William Marcet. Introduction. The therapeutic properties of zinc having become during the last few years a subject of much medical interest, I was induced to commence in 1855 a series of comparative inquiries respecting the action of oxide of zinc in epilepsy, chorea, mild hysteria, paralysis, and lead palsy, cases of exhaustion from excessive mental exertions, and another peculiar chronic disorder of the nervous system which is the subject of the present treaty. It soon became obvious that in certain of the above diseases the treatment adopted effected a complete recovery, or was attended by a very marked improvement, that in others it was followed by no material benefit, and even in a few instances of hysteria was open to objection. I observed that this substance was most remarkably beneficial when given to patients suffering from chronic disorder of the nervous system, characterized by sleepiness, giddiness, headache, flying specks passing before the eyes, muscae volitantes, noises in the ears, tinnitus aurium, hallucinations, trembling, and want of coordination of the voluntary motions. The disease became frequently accompanied by a morbid condition of the organs of digestion. It then appeared to me probable, and I soon afterwards discovered, that these symptoms were owing to one and the same cause, particularly the excessive use of alcoholic stimulants. I now commenced a series of investigations as to the property of oxide of zinc in controlling and curing the disorder in question, taking notes of the symptoms and other particulars of the cases of this affection admitted under my care at the Westminster Hospital. In December 1858, I communicated to the London Western Medical and Surgical Society a paper showing that oxide of zinc was exceedingly efficacious in the treatment of chronic alcoholic intoxication, and abstracts of this paper were published shortly afterwards in the Medical Times Gazette, footnote, February 12, 1859, end footnote, and in the Lancet, footnote, April 2, 1859, end footnote. Subsequent observations having fully confirmed the correctness of the above-mentioned results, I have thought it might be useful to publish in its present form an account of the chronic functional disturbance of the nervous system brought on by the abuse of spirituous stimulants and of the treatment adopted in these cases. I was engaged in the preparation of the first edition of the treaty for the press when the valuable publication on alcoholism by Magnus Huss of Stockholm came under my notice. In this work the author has fully and accurately described the disease now under consideration. It may be observed, however, that his attention has been more particularly directed to the symptoms and pathology of the disorder, while in the present volume comparatively great stress has been laid on the predisposing and immediate causes of the illness, and especially on its mode of treatment. In order to be assured of the correctness of my statements, I have confined myself almost exclusively to the results of my own experience, avoiding as much as possible filling up omissions by borrowing from the writings of others. The following, therefore, is a mere sketch of a vast and important subject, but, however incomplete it may be, it will, I trust, be found not altogether devoid of interest and usefulness. Since the publication of my first edition, I have continued giving much attention to the effects resulting from the use and abuse of spirituous stimulants, and now beg to offer the reader a few preliminary remarks on the influence of spirituous stimulants on the healthy body. I have also thought it advisable to introduce into the present volume the account of a series of inquiries I have undertaken, in order to ascertain what diseases those who drink too much are principally exposed. These investigations were first published in the British and Foreign Medico-Chirurgical Review for April 1862, under the title An Inquiry into the Influence of the Abuse of Alcohol as a Predisposing Cause of Disease. Several new and interesting cases bearing on chronic alcoholism will be found recorded in this edition. Finally, I have recommended the administration in some instances of zinc under a form of solution in water, prepared by acting on carbonate of zinc with carbonic acid. 27 Wimpole Street, October 1862. End of introduction. On the action of alcohol in health. The following observations will apply more particularly to the mode of admission of spirituous stimulants into the body, the effects they produce therein, and the exit or elimination of alcohol from the body. First, introduction of alcohol into the body. Although spirituous stimulants as a beverage are never taken but through the mouth, still alcohol occasionally enters the human economy by other channels. It may reach the blood through the lungs in the form of vapor. Very probably also small quantities pass through the skin into the circulating fluid. Individuals who spend their time in public houses from habit or necessity, such as inveterate drinkers, gin palace proprietors, tap room waiters, and also those employed in distilleries or breweries, must imbibe alcohol through the lungs, and probably also, to a small extent, through the skin. It should be remembered that the atmosphere of a public house at the tap or elsewhere is more or less impregnated with the vapors of alcohol, derived from the partly full liquor glasses, the beer slops which usually soil the counter, and more especially from the breath of the drinkers. The act of hard drinking implies not only the admission into the stomach of large quantities of spirituous liquors, but also the elimination or distillation through the lungs of part of the alcohol the beverage contains. Consequently, those of the company who drink but little, or perhaps not at all, breathe these alcoholic vapors and take them in, the absorption being increased by the great affinity of alcohol for the moist tissues of the lungs. In the case of those present in an atmosphere impregnated with vapors of alcohol, and who have freely partaken of the stimulants, it is difficult to conceive that any but the very smallest quantities can be absorbed by the lungs. Yet the alcoholic vapors in the air must indirectly add to the accumulation of alcohol within the blood, by interfering with the diffusion or passage of the vapor of spirits from the blood into the air inspired. The more the air which is breathed is free of alcoholic vapors, the greater must be elimination or loss of alcohol by the lungs. And inversely, the more alcoholic the air respired, the less the elimination of alcohol by the lungs. And this is obviously one of the reasons which account for the fact that alcoholic intoxication often disappears rapidly by exposure to the open air. It is difficult to prove experimentally this indirect action of alcoholic vapors, but a similar phenomenon is known to take place when the air inspired contains an excess of carbonic acid gas, a substance possessed of highly deleterious properties, so that poisoning by carbonic acid is a phenomenon due partly to the absorption of carbonic acid into the blood through the lungs, partly to the obstacle to the elimination through these same organs of the carbonic acid generated within the body. I have attempted to show, in a communication to the Medical Times Gazette, that in cases where chloroform is given, a large quantity of chloroform vapor in the air inspired is doubly dangerous, directly by increasing the amount of anesthetic agent in the blood, and indirectly by interfering with the elimination of that which has already been absorbed. Footnote: see the Medical Times Gazette for July 30th, 1861. End footnote. Cases of poisoning by alcohol have happened from the introduction of this substance into the body by no other means than the lungs. Footnote: it must be remembered that the whole of the alcohol absorbed by the lungs passes at once into the blood, while there is every reason to believe that but a very small portion of the alcohol taken into the stomach, which proportion however may be sufficient to produce intoxication, is absorbed by the blood. End footnote. Such instances, however, are very rare, for it is seldom those engaged in places where the fumes of brandy accumulate largely do not themselves indulge in the baneful practice. And, moreover, it must be admitted that but few individuals are sufficiently predisposed to alcoholic poisoning to be affected merely by the vapors of alcohol. I have witnessed the following instances of disease, owing in all probability to the introduction of alcohol into the blood through the lungs. Beebe, a barman, called at the Westminster Hospital as an outpatient on June 30th, 1859. During the past 6 months has spent his time closely confined in a public house. Is engaged with giving out beer, spirits, etc., from 8 in the morning till 11:30 p.m., Sundays included. He has not taken to the habit of drinking, his allowance being half a pint of beer daily, and half a quartern of spirits once a week or a fortnight. He says he cannot take a pint of ale without feeling unwell after it. Previous to being employed in a public house, he never suffered from the symptoms which occasioned his visit to the hospital, and could drink a pint and a half of beer without inconvenience. He then followed the trade of a blacksmith, and his health was quite good in every respect. Now complains of general nervous uneasiness, and is subject to a slight trembling in the evening when in the sitting posture. There is occasionally a sensation of numbness in the hands and of formication in the legs. Perceives noises in the ears and is affected with temporary deafness, and is not troubled with hallucinations. He cannot sleep well at night, and slumber disturbed by nightmare. Feels weak in the hips and knees. No pains in the epigastric region. Appetite very bad. Tongue white. Bowels costive. Has suffered more or less, as stated above, for the last 3 months, and cannot ascribe the attack to any particular cause. This illness is precisely that which would result from the abuse of alcohol, and, as he drank but very little, it is fair to conclude that he was affected by alcohol which entered his body through the lungs, and probably also through the skin. Second, action of alcohol within the body, and its elimination therefrom. We shall consider in succession, first, the local action of alcohol on the membranes with which it comes into contact, and secondly, its influence on the central vital organs. 1. Local or direct action of alcohol. Spirituous stimulants, when swallowed, begin by exerting a local action on the living membrane of the throat, esophagus, and stomach. It is very difficult, if not impossible, to determine, by means of a minute examination, the state of these parts when moistened with an alcoholic fluid, but a correct answer may be obtained to this inquiry by observing, under the microscope, what takes place when alcohol is dropped on the web of a frog's foot. This membrane, being comparatively transparent and abundantly supplied with capillary blood vessels, is peculiarly fitted for the observation in question, and it may be safely inferred that the local action of alcohol on the esophagus and stomach is similar to that of this fluid on the web of a frog's foot. Supposing the animal is placed in such a position as will be most convenient for the experiment, 1 or 2 of the largest capillaries with its ramifications are brought into the field of the microscope. There the blood will be seen circulating at a uniform rate. If alcohol, diluted with 10 or 15 times its bulk of water, be dropped on the frog's foot, the blood will be immediately observed to flow quicker. The corpuscles succeed each other more rapidly in the largest vessels. Smaller branches, which could not previously be seen, become full of blood, apparently spring into existence, and gradually a beautiful network of the finest capillaries is distinctly visible. In the course of a few minutes, the rapidity of the circulation is so far increased that the globules can no longer be distinguished. The result of the inquiry will be very different if, instead of diluted spirits, strong commercial alcohol be dropped on the frog's foot. In this case, the reverse takes place. The capillary vessels appear to contract, the blood corpuscles cluster together, and the circulation quickly becomes sluggish. Gradually the smallest capillaries disappear, and shortly afterwards the circulation stops in the largest streams, with a slight oscillatory movement. By washing the web with water the state of things is not altered, and the circulation cannot possibly be restored. After a few days, ulceration of the web takes place, and in the course of some weeks it entirely disappears. We conclude by analogy that when weak alcoholic beverages, such as beer or wine or diluted spirits, are taken, the rapidity of the capillary circulation becomes greater throughout the whole of the alimentary canal from the mouth to the stomach. The rapid flow of blood is necessarily attended with an increased exercise of the functions of these parts. Thus the secretion of saliva is promoted. The mucous fluid which covers the lining membrane of the esophagus and stomach becomes more abundant. Under the influence of food, the gastric juice is more readily secreted. The absorption of the fluid elements of food is favored, and the digestion thereby improved. I really cannot agree with the advocates of total abstinence, who call this a morbid phenomena, even admitting with Dr. Carpenter that this excitement of the circulation is followed by a reaction or a state of depression. I can hardly admit the strength of this argument, as showing the advantage of total abstinence, for as soon as the digestion is completed, there is no further requirement for a vascular condition of the stomach. On the contrary, it wants complete repose, and I do not see the disadvantage of an exsanguine condition of this organ within certain limits during fasting. It should be understood I am now alluding to the moderate use of weak alcoholic beverages, as beer or wine, at 1 or 2 meals only. for I consider it a very injudicious habit with regard to health to drink wine or beer on an empty stomach, and I condemn raw spirits as being most objectionable in every respect as an article of diet. When, instead of a moderate allowance of weak alcoholic stimulants, a large quantity of a fermented beverage or raw spirits are taken, then the action will be of a totally different kind. The liquor now produces morbid effects by greatly reducing the rate of the capillary circulation of the stomach. This phenomenon may be the result of two causes. First, the direct action of strong alcohol in the capillary vessels, illustrated by the experiments on the frog's web I have described, and secondly, the reaction from the stimulation produced by the long-continued contact of alcohol with the living membrane. This reaction Dr. Carpenter considers as a frequent source of those diseases which affect drinkers. After the immoderate use of alcoholic stimulants, especially on an empty stomach, the secretion of mucus will be checked, mucous membranes being thereby deprived of their principal protection against the baneful effects of strong spirits. Next, the healthy process of nutrition of the stomach will be modified, the organ losing part of its vitality and becoming exposed to suffer from the chemical action of alcohol on dead animal tissues. Finally, the same loss of functions or deficiency of the vis natura of the stomach is in itself a condition of disease, and favors the development of a variety of morbid affections, perhaps allied to the phenomena of gangrene from the stoppage of the circulation after the ligature of a blood vessel. It is but a natural consequence of this depressed state of the circulation under the influence of strong alcohol, or of the long-continued abuse of weaker stimulants, that the sensibility and motility of the part affected should become diminished. Sensation and motion in a part cannot take place if its circulation be arrested. Thus, for example, by placing a ligature round the thoracic aorta of a dog, an operation I have performed on several occasions, the sensation and motion of the animal's body posterior to the ligature immediately and entirely disappear, although the nerves which supply these parts are left undisturbed. Therefore, if under the morbid influence of alcoholic stimulants the circulation of the stomach is checked, partly or entirely, the sensibility and motility of this organ much diminish. When spirituous beverages are drunk in excess at meals, various circumstances contribute to lessen the injurious influence. First, the food the stomach contains mixes with the alcoholic fluid, preventing its rapid action on the stomach and at the same time diluting it by the addition of the water the meat, vegetables, and other solid ingesta contain. Secondly, the gastric juice, an aqueous acid fluid, which is secreted by the stomach in large quantity during digestion, adds greatly to the dilution of the alcoholic fluid. Third, the flow of saliva, a secretion consisting of little more than pure water, taking place actively during meals, likewise assists in diluting spirituous stimulants in the stomach. Notwithstanding these circumstances, it frequently happens that an overindulgence in wine or beer at a dinner party proves hurtful, and I believe it is principally by checking the capillary circulation of the stomach, and thereby stopping the flow of gastric juice in the process of digestion and absorption, that indigestion, independently of intoxication, not unfrequently occurs under these circumstances. As a proof of this, I might remark that in consequence of a late dinner where an excess of wine has been indulged in, symptoms of indigestion will appear next morning after an uncomfortable night, and the food eaten 12 hours previously will be vomited nearly in the same state as when taken, showing that the proper quantity of gastric juice had not been secreted. It is very probable that the presence of much alcohol in the stomach interferes with the normal action of gastric juice on food, but this hypothesis would hardly suffice to account for the food being vomited after many hours, without apparently having undergone any of those changes which we know to be due to the action of gastric juice. Direct or local action on the nerves. When fermented beverages are taken in moderate quantity, it is obvious, from the increased rapidity of the circulation they induce in the membranes with which they come into contact, that the alcoholic fluid exerts a local action on the nerves, ramifying on these membranes. It is difficult to determine the precise seat of this action, but we may surmise that it is exerted principally on the sympathetic, this system supplying twigs which accompany arteries into their minutest divisions. If we now bear in mind the fact revealed to us by C. L. Bernard, footnote, Lacan sur la physiologique et la pathologique du système nerveux, Volume 2, page 493, that, by cutting a branch of the sympathetic nerve, the circulation of the part which is supplied by that nerve is greatly increased, and also that this very same increased rate of circulation takes place where alcohol is present in the stomach. It is but rational to conclude that alcohol, when first absorbed by the minutest blood vessels, has the property of lessening the normal functions of the sympathetic nerves which supply those vessels. Shock. Raw spirits taken suddenly in very large quantities have been known to cause insensibility so rapidly that this could not be accounted for, unless by assuming that the influence was owing to a direct action on the extremities of the nerves ramifying on the stomach, producing a shock. We read the following remark at page 41 of Macnish's interesting volume on the anatomy of drunkenness. When a large quantity of intoxicating fluid has been suddenly taken to the stomach, the usual preliminary symptoms of drunkenness do not appear. An instantaneous stupefaction ensues, and the person is at once knocked down. This cannot be imputed to distension of the cerebral vessels, but to a sudden operation on the nervous branches of the stomach. By experimenting on frogs, I have shown in a paper read at the British Association 1859, that a sudden temporary suspension of sensibility or shock is occasionally brought on when the hind legs of these animals are suddenly immersed in strong alcohol, and I have obtained positive proof that this phenomenon is due to an influence exerted exclusively on the extremities of the nerves supplying those limbs, by observing this same effect to take place after the circulation of the parts in contact with alcohol have been entirely arrested. When, on the contrary, the nerves of the limbs immersed in alcohol were severed from the center, the circulation being left undisturbed, a shock never happened. In the experiments in question, it was obvious that the sudden occurrence of insensibility or anesthesia was due to an action of the alcoholic fluid on the extremities of the cerebrospinal nerves, which action had been transmitted by these nerves to the brain. The phenomena of reflex nervous action continued, for the respiration appeared unimpaired, and after the lapse of some minutes the shock passed off with the return of sensibility, although the frog's hind legs had not been removed from the alcohol. 2. Influence of alcohol in the central vital organs. By vital organs I mean the heart, lungs, and nervous centers. After entering the circulation at the stomach, alcohol is quickly conveyed to the heart, increasing its action so that the whole circulation becomes more rapid. There is no difficulty in proving this, by observing the injected capillaries of the face and the action of the pulse after spirituous stimulants have been taken. At the same time, as a natural consequence of the increased circulation, the respiration becomes quicker, and the secretions, especially that of the kidneys, are excited. From the right side of the heart, alcohol passes into the lungs. On its way through these organs the blood loses a part, and perhaps a large portion, of its alcohol, which is displaced by the air inspired, and ejected under the form of vapor with carbonic acid during expiration. This passage of alcohol through the delicate membrane of the lungs, conjointly with the increased action of the heart, keeps the pulmonary circulation in a perpetual abnormal state of excitement, and the lungs become thereby greatly predisposed to disease. The elimination of alcohol from the blood by the lungs is easily demonstrated experimentally by breathing through a solution of chromic acid, after having taken an alcoholic beverage, when the red chromic acid solution turns green. The proportion of alcohol expired under the form of vapor must, however, be very small, in comparison with that which has been swallowed, as may be safely inferred from the following experiment. Messrs. Lallemande, Perrin, and Duroy, du rôle de l'alcool et des anesthésiques dans l'organisme, 1860, endeavored to collect the alcohol expired by the lungs of 4 men who had each of them taken 100 grams, rather more than 3 ounces of brandy. Although for this purpose a condensing apparatus of 27 feet in length was used, kept at the temperature of the freezing point, and the experiment made to last 4 hours, still the fluid obtained the condenser, after being submitted to double rectification on quicklime, exhibited but a very weak alcoholic smell, and was not inflammable. This shows that it is an error to conceive that the whole of the alcohol drunk, or even the greater part of it, passes off by the lungs, although it is highly probable that the whole of the alcohol which has been absorbed into the blood is, after a certain time, nearly entirely expired. Footnote: a small proportion of the alcohol which has passed into the blood is eliminated through the skin and in the urinary secretions. Lallemant, and Duroy. This evaporation of alcohol from the skin has been demonstrated experimentally to the Society of Arts by Dr. Edward Smith, who has given much attention to the physiological action of alcohol stimulants. See Journal of the Society of Arts for January 18, 1861, and the cyclical changes in the human system. End footnote. I cannot help believing that by far the greatest proportion of the alcohol taken by habitual drinkers is not at all absorbed into the blood, but, after undergoing certain chemical changes, is eliminated through the intestines with the other excreta. The alcohol remaining in the blood, after circulating through the lungs, is now conveyed to the brain and spinal cord and the other parts of the body. There exists in the substance of the brain a well-known power of attraction for alcohol, causing this fluid to be taken up by the cerebral matter and accumulated therein, each portion of the blood circulating through the brain and other nervous centers, yielding to them an additional quantity of alcohol. This fact has been discovered by Dr. Piercy. Footnote: an experimental inquiry concerning the presence of alcohol in the ventricles of the brain, 1839. End footnote. And confirmed by Messrs. Lallemant, and Duroy. The attraction of nervous matter for alcohol would lead us to believe that alcohol acts on the cerebrospinal centers, from its being absorbed into the circulation at the stomach, and carried to the brain and spinal cord by the blood. This I consider I have proved by the researches embodied in my paper to the British Association. I have shown, moreover, that alcohol exerts also an influence on the brain which is transmitted exclusively through the nervous tracts, and that this action may be of two kinds, producing a shock with a temporary suspension of sensibility, or merely giving rise to a weakening process which hastens the fatal termination. Spasms of the glottis. Although my attention has been for many years directed to the action of spirituous stimulants on the human body, I was not aware of the occurrence of asphyxia owing to alcohol producing spasm of the glottis, until, on accidentally looking into the medico-chirurgical transactions for 1837, I met there with the account of a very interesting case of suspended animation by alcohol, attended with symptoms of asphyxia, and where life was saved by tracheotomy. The report is entitled, "A Case of Recovery from the Insensibility of Intoxication by the Performance of Tracheotomy, by George Sampson, Esquire." The patient, a man aged 31, was brought to Mr. Sampson's house in a state of complete insensibility from intoxication, after having drunk freely of beer and more than a pint of brandy. All voluntary motion had been lost for at least 4 hours. The stomach pump was first applied. The ipecacuanha and afterwards sulfate of zinc were administered without producing vomiting. The patient's breathing was becoming more and more difficult, and his pulse scarcely perceptible. The body was cold and clammy, and insensible to every kind of stimulant. He was then removed to the infirmary, and a consultation was held with the other medical attendants, who arrived in the course of half an hour. At that time every appearance indicated the rapid approach of death. It then occurred to Mr. Sampson, from the shrill tone and extreme difficulty of the respiration, that the comatose state of the patient might be accounted for by collapse or spasm of the glottis, and with this view of the case, Mr. Sampson strongly urged that a trial should be given to the operation of tracheotomy. The operation was accordingly performed, and no sooner was the trachea opened than the distension of the veins about the head and neck subsided, the violent efforts of the respiratory muscles ceased, and in about half an hour regular and easy respiration through the wound was completely established. The case proceeded very satisfactorily. In about 3 weeks the wound had healed, and the patient was discharged cured. This case is full of interest, for it clearly shows that the fatal termination of poisoning by alcohol may be due to sudden asphyxia from a spasmodic closure of the glottis, a phenomenon similar to that which takes place occasionally from poisoning by carbonic acid, and likewise threatening life in certain diseases as epilepsy, laryngismus stridulus, and whooping cough. In the following case reported by Dr. Ogston, footnote, Edinburgh Medical and Surgical Journal, 1833, end footnote. It appears probable that the final cause of death was asphyxia from the spasm of the glottis. A.W. came home one night much intoxicated, as was his usual practice. Before he could be got to bed, he became sick and vomited a little, and afterwards small quantities through the night. During the first part of the night he was restless, slept little, and when awake appeared confused, and unable or unwilling to give any account of his feeling. After this he took more spirits. Towards the morning he became very cold, and fell into what was considered a sound sleep. But he was soon observed to breathe heavily, and could not be awakened. His relatives, becoming alarmed, called in Dr. Ogston at 9 o'clock. The patient's pupils were dilated, pulse imperceptible, profound coma, extremities very cold, face pale, breathing laborious. His chest began to heave convulsively. He threw out his arms rapidly, withdrawing them suddenly. The lips became blue, and in a few minutes he expired. Some spasmodic twitchings of the muscles of the face were noticed an instant or two before death. At the post-mortem examination of the body, it was found that both lungs were congested with a dark, fluid blood. A dark blood was found in the ventricles of the heart. The blood of the veins generally was fluid and dark colored. Mode of death from alcohol. Post-mortem appearance. The instances reported of death from acute poisoning by alcohol are not very numerous. Ruysch, in his book on the abuse of spirituous stimulants, footnote, De l'abus des boissons spiritueuses, page 67, end footnote, relates an instance of death from alcoholism narrated by Dr. Hardham. A boy 5 years old, after drinking a large quantity of brandy, was carried away in a state of complete stupor. When placed on his legs he fell, and when on the ground, pure brandy flowed out of his mouth. After some time he vomited, without however being relieved, and in consciousness did not return. Towards 10 o'clock in the evening, there is no statement as to the hour when the brandy was drunk, he suddenly became cold, and had an attack of shivering, uttering slight groans. Finally he died in convulsions at 4 o'clock in the morning. Dr. Ogston cites several causes of death from alcohol, and reports minutely on the condition of the organs after death. Dr. Peters of New York states that he has examined the bodies of nearly 70 persons who had died from the excessive use of ardent spirits. Footnote: On the Pathological Effects of Alcohol, by John C. Peters, M.D., New York Journal of Medicine, Volume 3, end footnote. With respect to the post-mortem appearances after death from acute poisoning by alcohol, we may conclude with Dr. Carpenter that they usually resemble more or less closely those of asphyxia. The right side of the heart, the pulmonary arteries, and the systemic veins being loaded with blood, whilst the left cavities and the arterial system are comparatively empty, the blood which they contain being dark. The actual cause of death from alcohol must be consequently a state of paralysis of the muscles of respiration, preventing the normal expansion of the lungs, and thereby the entrance of air into these organs, as in the case of narcotic poisons in general, or else the presence of alcohol in the circulation, by interfering with or checking the action of air on the blood within the circulation, gives rise to a morbid condition incompatible with the maintenance of life. Physiological experiments show that both these phenomena may be the ultimate causes of death from alcohol. For, according to Humboldt, if the crural nerve of a frog be dipped in alcohol, the period of excitement produced at first is soon succeeded by paralysis, so that the limb can no longer be excited into contraction by galvanizing that nerve. Now, if we consider the known power of cerebrospinal nerves of accumulating alcohol within their tissue, it may safely be inferred from Humboldt's experiment that the normal influence of the nervous centers on the muscles of respiration become gradually annihilated, and death ensues by slow asphyxia. This is, in fact, the usual explanation of death from alcohol. It has been shown, however, by Bochardet and Sandris, footnote, on the digestion of alcoholic fluids and their office in nutrition, British and Foreign Medico-Chirurgical Review, Volume 2, 1847, end footnote, that the presence of alcohol in the blood interferes with or prevents the due aeration of this fluid, so that the blood corpuscles no longer undergo the normal change from dark to bright red, the dark color being permanent. It should seem, therefore, that although oxygen is absorbed from the air, as in the normal process of respiration, yet it fails to act on the blood corpuscles, bringing on a condition perfectly similar to that resulting from asphyxia. Admitting that, in some cases, death results from the impediment offered by alcohol to the influence and oxygen on the blood corpuscles, this would explain the occasional occurrence of spasms of the glottis. For in those conditions which prevent the normal action of air upon the blood corpuscles, as in the case of asphyxia, from drowning spasm of the glottis occurs, and even a secondary contraction of the glottis may take place during recovery from drowning. Footnote: see a letter by the author to the Medical Times Gazette for February 1857, end footnote. End of section 1. Section 2 of On Chronic Alcoholic Intoxication, with an inquiry into the influence of the abuse of alcohol as a predisposing cause of disease, by William Marcet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. On Chronic Alcoholic Intoxication. The injurious effect upon health arising from the abuse of wine, beer, or spirits, and generally from all alcoholic stimulants, have been usually considered under two following heads. First, as the immediate consequence of an excessive indulgence on a particular occasion, and secondly, as a result of long-continued intemperance. It is not my intention to dwell upon the immediate action of alcohol upon the human body, producing drunkenness, this subject having been admirably treated by Drs. Trotter, footnote, an Essay Medical, Philosophical, and Chemical on Drunkenness, 1804, end footnote, Macnish, footnote, The Anatomy of Drunkenness, 1832, end footnote, and Roche, footnote, De l'abus des boissons spiritueuses, 1839, end footnote, and more recently by Dr. Carpenter in his valuable prize essay on the use and abuse of alcoholic liquors in health and disease. I purpose to direct the reader's attention to a most distressing form of disease affecting the nervous system, which those unfortunate persons who persist in drinking to excess seldom escape, and which constitutes a state of prolonged or chronic poisoning. This affection is known by the name of chronic alcoholic intoxication or chronic alcoholism, and is thus defined by Magnus Huss. The name chronic alcoholism applies the collective symptoms of a disordered condition of the mental, motor, and sensory functions of the nervous system, these symptoms assuming a chronic form, and without their being immediately connected with any of those organic modifications of the central or peripheric portions of the nervous system which may be detected during life, or discovered after death by ocular inspection. Such symptoms, moreover, affecting individuals who have persisted for a considerable length of time in the abuse of alcoholic liquors. The habit of indulging too freely in spirituous beverages, even without their producing intoxication, is often attended at first with no apparent evil result, and there is little or no warning given of the injury done to the constitution. But sooner or later the injurious effects of excess and frequent alcoholic libations will become obvious, occurring sometimes under the form of delirium tremens, although much more frequently assuming the condition of the chronic disease which will be subsequently described. The difference between delirium tremens and chronic alcoholism is distinctly marked. The former consists of an acute and violent disturbance of the functions of the nervous system, bearing a strong resemblance to that most formidable disease, inflammation of the brain and its membranes. It is not a chronic or vague complaint. Watson. The hallucinations are of a most frightful character, keeping the patient in a state of excessive terror and excitement. According to Macnish, delirium tremens lasts for 4 to 10 days. Chronic alcoholism, although resembling the other affection in a mitigated condition, assumes the form of a protracted illness, with none of the paroxysms of violent delirium so peculiar to delirium tremens. Chronic alcoholic intoxication, again, is a state of long and uninterrupted suffering, allowing the patient no rest day or night. He may have given up the habit of drinking before the outbreak of the disease, or if attacked during a period of excessive indulgence, he may endeavor by a great effort to shake off his old and pernicious habit. But even if successful, he will not unfrequently be disappointed in the hope of regaining his lost health. Week after week, month after month, year after year, he patiently waits for the termination of his sufferings. and endeavors to apply the remains of his strength to such occupations as will tear him away for the time from his miseries, although he usually finds himself so weak that he is denied even this poor source of relief. My attention having been directed for several years to an inquiry into the symptoms and treatment of the disorder in question, I have decided upon communicating in this little volume the results of those inquiries to the medical profession and the public. I shall begin with a description of the symptoms of chronic alcoholic intoxication. The circumstances predisposing the individual to suffer from the disease will next be duly investigated, to be followed by an inquiry into the immediate causes of the attack, and a short account of certain diseases resembling chronic alcoholism, although not depending on excess in spirituous drinks. I shall afterwards insist more particularly on the treatment of the disorder, and show how effectually it may be placed under medical control, offering a faithful report of 48 cases which have fallen under my care. The notes of these cases have been taken during the patient's visits, and consequently do not depend for accuracy upon mere recollection. Footnote: a synoptical table is appended to this treatise, giving an account of 48 cases of chronic alcoholism treated by the author at the Westminster Hospital. End footnote. Symptoms of chronic alcoholism. Dr. Carpenter's prize essay, page 30, alludes to the symptoms of chronic alcoholism in the following words: "It is important to remark that a slighter form of the disorder, delirium tremens, marked by tremors of the hands and feet, deficiency of nervous power, and occasional illusions, will sometimes occur as a consequence of habitual tippling, even without intoxication having been once produced, and a still slighter manifestation of the want of control of the muscular apparatus, the trembling of the hands in the execution of a voluntary movement, is familiar to everyone as extremely frequent among the habitually intemperate." Dr. Carpenter further observes, page 46, that the effects of drunkenness are highly inimical to a permanent healthy state of the brain, is often proved at a great distance of time from the course of intemperance, and long after the adoption of regular habits. The remote effects of alcoholic poisoning have also been very ably considered by a French author, Roche, but he includes chronic alcoholism among a number of other diseases resulting indirectly from long-continued intemperance, and thus omits classification which is of the highest importance respecting the treatment of the disorder in question. The symptoms of the disease depend on a functional disturbance of the nervous system, which may last for weeks, months, or years, even after the habit of excessive drinking has been given up. On first applying to his medical advisor, the patient will probably not state the cause of his illness, and thus seriously mislead the physician in his estimation of the nature of the complaint. If we try to account for this difficulty of establishing the cause of the disease in cases of chronic alcoholism, it will be found that in some instances the patient is ashamed of his intemperance and will not confess it. In others, he considers that the nature of his occupation is such as to require an excessive amount of drink. He is seldom or never drunk. In his opinion, he takes no more than is absolutely required, and he is not aware of his suffering from alcoholic stimulants. Some will positively disbelieve that their illness can be owing to the abuse of alcoholic liquors, as they have been under a pledge to drink very little or none at all for some time previously. But it will be noticed in the course of the examination that before taking the pledge these individuals were thorough drunkards, and had been obliged to give up drinking on account of their health. Finally, in those instances where the mind has been affected through frequent fits of drunkenness and repeated attacks of delirium tremens, the patient may be unable or unwilling to give plain answers to the questions of the physician. He will perhaps endeavor to turn aside the conversation and adroitly avoid the subject. I have observed a well-marked instance of this kind in a boy of 18, whose case I had great difficulty at first in making out, but a fortnight afterwards, his health having been much improved, he gave me a clear account of his illness. There is something peculiar in the look and gait of individuals in the habit of drinking to excess, or even of habitual tipplers, which will greatly assist in discovering the nature of the complaint, even before addressing the patient. His peculiar complexion, often sharp features, or, if he be fat, the injected cheeks and nose, and their violet appearance, the trembling of the limbs, often of the whole body, or a want of steadiness and coordination in the movements, not very unlike incipient cholera. All these are so many symptoms the medical practitioner will not fail to observe. On conversing with such patients, their intellect will frequently not be found blunted, and the account they give of their suffering is perhaps remarkably clear. Inability to sleep. One of the prominent symptoms of chronic alcoholism is inability to sleep and great restlessness at night. The sufferer perpetually keeps turning over in bed, and as soon as he shuts his eyes, extraordinary visions, mostly of a painful kind, appear before him. For example, a patient told me he frequently saw a funeral passing as he was endeavoring to compose himself. Sleep, also when obtained, is disturbed by frightful dreams, which appear often to indicate a considerable degree of mental excitement. The patient frequently dreams he has been at his work all night. He awakens in the morning exhausted and almost incapable of any exertion. The ill effect produced on sleep by excessive drinking is well illustrated in the following case of A.T., age 25, case 45. He is in the habit of taking daily 1 pint of beer and 3 or 4 glasses of gin. Once a week on Saturday he increases his allowance to 7 or 8 pints of beer and 5 or 6 glasses of gin. He cannot sleep on the nights of Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, but on Wednesday night he sleeps better, and pretty well on Friday night. He is also troubled with hallucinations and the other usual symptoms of chronic alcoholism, being invariably worse after his Saturday's excess. Trembling. In the daytime the patient is seized with trembling, especially when in a sitting posture. Some hardly tremble at all when waking. The trembling may be very slight indeed, or confined to a particular part of the body, being frequently visible in the tongue, or it may only occur at intervals. Some merely tremble in the morning on getting up, and many affected by chronic alcoholism experience more or less difficulty in dressing themselves from want of sufficient control over their movements. As already mentioned, there is often much awkwardness in the performance of voluntary motion, even when the body is not subject to conspicuous trembling. Thus, in the act of drinking, a liquid will be spilt from the glass, or a light will be put out instead of being snuffed. It is remarkable how long this condition may last, and how rapidly it disappears under appropriate treatment. Giddiness and headache. The patient also generally complains of great giddiness, more especially when raising the head from the recumbent posture, or when suddenly turning round. Headache and a ringing noise in the ears, tinnitus aurium, are frequent, although not constant symptoms. Hallucinations. The occurrence of hallucinations, so characteristic of delirium tremens, is very often noticed in chronic alcoholism, although to a much more subdued extent. They mostly affect the organs of sight. For instance, one of my patients, when walking in the street, had seen ropes dangling about his head. To another, objects appeared as if they were double. Some perceived occasionally insects creeping about, the various visions often disappearing as soon as the attention was directed to them. These factitious perceptions of the sight appear sometimes so real that the individual moves aside to avoid an imaginary object standing in his way. Cabman, case 47, I was treating for chronic alcoholism, told me he frequently pulled up his horse suddenly, or drove to one side of the street lest he should run over some obstacle he distinctly saw in front of his horse, and which he afterwards found not to exist in reality. In his case, objects appeared to be multiplied to as many as 10 times the real number, so that if a lamp post, a man, or a car happened to be near him, he perceived 10 lamp posts, or 10 men, or as many carts. He could not possibly make out which object was really to be avoided, and was obliged to give up driving on account of the risk of an accident. In most cases, the patient is considerably or perhaps constantly troubled with shadows, or a black mist, or flying specks, muscae volantantes, passing rapidly before his eyes, and causing a dimness of sight, especially when he is looking attentively at something. In the act of reading, for example, the book is suddenly darkened, and a state of almost complete blindness ensues, lasting a few minutes. I have met with instances where patients perceive spots and sparks of all kinds of bright colors. Footnote: Magnus Huss has observed cases of chronic alcoholism where objects appeared peculiarly colored. He reports having met with 2 instances of hallucinations of the smell, and also with hallucinations of the taste, the patients believing they were drinking brandy instead of water. End of footnote. During the long and sleepless nights, aberrations of sight frequently happen. The wife of a patient I was treating for chronic alcoholism told me her husband often fancied, whilst lying awake, that he saw rats and cats and various other descriptions of animals on the bedclothes. He used to doze at intervals, and in the morning could not recollect anything of the nightly visions. The aberrations of the sense of hearing are not so frequent, but I have met with patients who occasionally heard voices addressing them when nobody was present. Footnote: Magnus Huss has frequently observed a feeling in the limbs of his patients as if they were pricked with needles, formication, and also they sometimes experience peculiar sensation as if something was creeping along their skin. End footnote. Weakness. Great weakness, especially in the knees and hips, which may sometimes be considered as a condition of threatened paralysis, is a prevalent character of chronic alcoholism. Indeed, this symptom is occasionally so severe as to interfere considerably with the various acts of voluntary motion. In one of my cases, case 22, the patient could hardly walk, even with the assistance of a stick, and this symptom continued after he had recovered in other respects. Difficulty of breathing. Difficulty of breathing, perceived in the throat as a sensation of choking, is a frequent symptom of chronic alcoholic intoxication, entirely independent of any affection of the lungs. This symptom was particularly marked in the case of W.B., case 1. He described the feeling as one of choking, his breathing being quite natural for a few minutes, and then becoming suddenly checked. He pointed to the larynx as a spot where he felt an obstacle to the respiration. Upon throwing his head backwards, he admitted through the mouth a quantity of air, and was afterwards able to breathe freely until the return of another spasm. The symptom is possibly owing to the frequent contact of alcoholic drinks with the glottis and epiglottis, and to the inflammation and tumefaction thereby induced, the action being somewhat similar, although in a greatly mitigated form, to that of strong mineral acids, which have been known to produce death in children from their contact with the glottis and epiglottis. Footnote: A.S. Taylor on Poisons, 2nd edition, page 426. End footnote. It may be also that these spasms result from the irritation produced by alcohol in the pharynx, inducing a contraction of the larynx by nervous reflex action. Again, Bochardet and Sandris have ascertained that when alcohol is introduced into the system in excess, the blood of the arteries presents the aspect of venous blood, showing that it has not undergone the proper oxygenating process, and it is possible that this circumstance might induce spasmodic contractions of the glottis through the medium of the brain and the spinal cord. It appears that the habit of swallowing air, so frequently met with in those who drink to excess, is in some way or other connected with the difficulty of breathing, which in fact, instead of relieving, as it apparently does at the time, it increases. In several cases, having warned patients of the importance of refraining from swallowing air, the compliance was attended with a considerable decrease of the sensation of choking. The habit of swallowing air, which after a time becomes an unconscious act, is not only extremely unpleasant from the frequent breaking of wind which it occasions, but is also the source of much intestinal uneasiness, and it is necessary to stop it as soon as possible. Whatever be the cause, spasms of the glottis certainly may occur under the influence of alcohol, as is shown by the following interesting case extracted from the Medico-Chirurgical Transactions for 1837, entitled Case of Recovery from the Insensibility of Intoxication by the Performance of Tracheotomy, by George Sampson, Esquire. The patient, aged 31, was brought to Mr. Sampson's house in a state of complete insensibility of drinking freely of beer and more than a pint of brandy. All voluntary motion had ceased for at least 4 hours. The stomach pump being used, drew off between 3 and 4 pints of fluid, the greater part of which appeared to consist of brandy. Every means of exciting vomiting was afterwards vainly applied. The man became more comatose, his countenance turgid, and breathing more and more difficult. The pulse grew fainter, and was at last scarcely perceptible. He was then removed to the infirmary, and a consultation was held with the other medical attendants, who arrived in the course of a half hour. At that time every appearance indicated the rapid approach of death, and there was no ground to justify a reasonable hope of recovery. It occurred to Mr. Sampson, when standing by the patient's bedside, that the extreme difficulty of respiration was owing to the existence of collapse of the glottis, and with this view of the case, he strongly urged that a trial should be given to the operation of tracheotomy. The operation was accordingly performed without loss of time by Mr. Andrews. The windpipe was no sooner opened than the distension of the veins about the head and neck subsided, the violent efforts of the respiratory muscles ceased, and in about half an hour regular and easy respiration through the wound was freely established. At the same time the pupils became slightly sensible to the stimulus of light, and the pulse returned to the wrist. He continued quiet during the night, but had no return of consciousness till the following morning. The case proceeded very satisfactorily, and the wound being healed in about 3 weeks, the patient was discharged cured. Having proceeded so far, I shall illustrate the chronic and acute stages of alcoholism. Footnote. By acute stage of alcoholism is meant delirium tremens. End footnote. By the account of the following case, which, I feel assured, will be read with interest. R.C., age 32, a cabman, applied to me at the Westminster Hospital as an outpatient on the 16th December 1861, but owing to the severity of his illness, I recommended him for admission as an inpatient. On the same day he was put to bed in Dr. Basham's ward and became a patient. For the last 5 or 6 years he had been a hard drinker, and particularly so for 4 or 5 weeks previous to his admission, during which time he has drunk as much as 1 quart of gin daily. 12 months ago he found that the excesses of alcohol he was committing acted injuriously on his health. His digestion and appetite became deficient. He was troubled in the morning with much sickness and vomited a yellow, bitter fluid. To relieve these symptoms he had recourse to some medicine, and gave up gin for ale, taking 4 or 5 pints of ale daily instead of a pint of gin, which he found to agree with him better. To this diet he did not, however, adhere long. For 2 or 3 months afterwards he again returned to gin. During the last 8 or 9 months his nervous system has been affected. I made out, however, that he had suffered from nervous symptoms previous to that time, and that he had observed them at first together with the derangement of the digestive organs. He meant that for the last 8 or 9 months nervous system had been more particularly implicated in the general alteration of his health. He states that there is no other cause but excess of drinking to account for this exacerbation of the nervous symptoms, and on this point I particularly insisted, knowing that other causes, besides the abuse of alcohol, may bring on chronic alcoholism in intemperate individuals. The disordered condition of the nervous system continued, increasing up to the present time. Since leading an intemperate life, he has not suffered from any illness beyond the derangement of the digestive and nervous functions directly connected with the abuse of alcohol. State of the patient for the last 6 weeks. Chronic alcoholism. Very little sleep, which is much disturbed by nightmare. Reposes more comfortably at night after he has been drinking on the previous evening, and is most restless if he cannot obtain his evening allowance, as on Saturdays and Sundays when public houses shut early. On these occasions he is more especially troubled with hallucinations on trying to compose himself to sleep. Sensation of giddiness in the morning while lying in bed, occasionally so strong as to make him believe he would fall on getting up. This symptom is accompanied by sickness and occasionally, although not often, by headache. To counteract this state of discomfort, he has a quartern of gin brought to him in bed, which partly succeeds in the object in view. Upon leaving his bed he sometimes vomits the spirits taken, but frequently the morning dram has the effect of removing the sickness. His eyesight has been gradually failing for this last 12 months, especially at night, by artificial light. When reading or looking at anything for a time, a mist forms over his eyes, and the letterpress of a book or newspaper suddenly disappears from before his sight. Sometimes he perceives as if brilliant and variously colored sparks were flying about him. He is troubled at times by abnormal perceptions, with his eyes both open and shut, is very subject to trembling and to numbness of the fingers and legs. Great weakness, which I believe to be, to a certain extent, more ideal than real, from the strength with which he can squeeze my hand with his fingers. Appetite very deficient. His food consists of tea, bread and butter and toast. He gave up driving his cab about the 25th of November. The intensity of the above symptoms gradually increased until, in addition to the sickness, the patient began to suffer great pain in the stomach, which prevented him from having recourse to his usual stimulant, and he gave up drinking completely. This abstinence, however, had not the desired effect of relieving the gastric symptoms, which became still more urgent. The disturbance of the nervous system likewise assumed suddenly acute features of a much severer description, and an attack of delirium tremens followed. Present state, acute alcoholism or delirium tremens. This attack may be considered as having suddenly begun 4 days after our patient had been obliged to give up drinking. At that period, the nervous and gastric symptoms assume a condition bearing much the same relation to the former stage of the illness as acute rheumatism bears to chronic rheumatism. This acute state of alcoholism commenced on the present occasion by our patient falling asleep, or rather becoming unconscious, and soon afterwards awakening covered with a cold, clammy sweat, which was quickly followed by an attack of trembling so strong as to make the bed shake violently. He felt very cold, weak, and giddy. His thoughts were very confused, and he had no control whatever over himself. Then, various extraordinary objects appeared before him, such as lions, tigers, and other animals, and his eyes were dazed by stars of every color. This state of things lasted for a quarter or half an hour, and then he again dozed. It was, he said, a slight slumber, during which he could hear any noise or anybody speaking. In this condition of semi-consciousness, of which he has vivid recollection, he was harassed by nightmare. He would be, for example, in his stables, kicked by a horse, driving his cab full of luggage, which he could not manage. The patient continued in this state, sometimes awake and sometimes slumbering, for 3 days and nights, for example, 72 hours. The intensity of the attack increasing all the while. When admitted into the hospital, he was rapidly losing all consciousness, so much so that the next day he actually was not aware of his being in a hospital. Since that time, in addition to other hallucinations, he has been haunted by extraordinary devil-like objects. While dozing, he has seen the figures of 2 females pulling him out of bed by the shoulders, for the purpose of dragging him into a well underneath. And when in the act of falling into this well, he suddenly awoke horrified and bathed in cold sweat. I took much pains to endeavor to find out whether the hallucinations were equally present while the patient was dozing and while he was awake, for if he perceived fanciful objects only during a state of sleep, or of unconsciously allied to sleep, the hallucinations might be compared to nightmare, as occurs sometimes in a state of health. I gathered from my inquiries that he was less troubled with hallucinations, and felt much more comfortable when awake than when dozing, but I also made out satisfactorily that his sleep or slumber was anything but natural sleep. It was a state of unconsciousness or delirium, the direct result of alcoholic poisoning, and the awaking from this state was merely the commencement of a period of temporary remission of the disease. The condition of our patient while dozing might be compared to that of hysteria. Nobody will call hysteric insensibility a natural sleep. Still, on recovering consciousness, the hysteric female believes she is awaking from a light slumber, during which time she has heard, as if in a dream, all that was said by those who stood near her. Of course, beyond the above-mentioned feature, the 2 diseases hardly bear comparison. 2 days after admission to the Westminster Hospital, the state of R.C. began to improve, evinced at first by a slight feeling of appetite and a feeble return of natural sleep at night. He was still troubled with nightmare, but it no longer assumed the distinct form of hallucination, and on awakening, the sights of imaginary objects vanished immediately. The sensation of giddiness gradually left him, the trembling was less severe, and he felt much more comfortable. On the 24th December, when I took the last part of these notes, appetite very good, no gastric pains, tongue slightly furred, did not sleep well last night, owing to the effects of a purgative medicine, but lay comfortable. He had slept quite well the night before. Says he feels much better since he has had meat to eat, but I believe it is principally because he is better that he has been able to eat meat. Has eaten more meat these last 2 or 3 days than for 5 or 6 weeks past. No longer any hallucination. Trembling very trifling, but is still nervous, being startled at any occurrence. Is becoming firmer on his legs and more cheerful. Has not felt so well for many months. A state of mild chronic alcoholism now returned. On the 13th of January, 1862, he was discharged from the ward, and began attending me as an outpatient. I have entered into details concerning the case, which may appear somewhat too minute, but I was anxious to take this opportunity of illustrating the symptoms of chronic alcoholism and showing the difference between chronic alcoholism and delirium tremens, and I trust this explanation will serve as an apology. End of section 2. Section 3 of On Chronic Alcoholic Intoxication, with an inquiry into the influence of the abuse of alcohol as a predisposing cause of disease by William Marcet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Causes predisposing to chronic alcoholism. It is a well-known fact that persons addicted to excessive drinking are not equally affected by it. The nature of the beverage, the quantity taken in, and the time during which the habit is indulged, the age, sex, temperament, habits, and occupation of the patient, the quality and quantity of the food taken, are so many circumstances modifying the action of alcohol in the body, and which may predispose it to suffer from chronic alcoholism. Quality taken. It might be considered at first sight that the more spirit or alcohol the beverage contains, the greater its deleterious action on the nervous system, and that we might consequently, from the known portion of alcohol in fermented drinks, establish a scale showing precisely their comparative tendency to bring on chronic alcoholism. Generally speaking, this rule holds good, and it will be found that raw spirits are the most hurtful. Then follow wine, beer, and cider. Except, however, in a general point of view, the injurious properties of alcoholic liquors do not always depend on the proportion of spirits they contain. McNish furnishes us with some valuable information on the effects of the different qualities of alcoholic stimulants. In his opinion, the safest way to use spirits is in the form of grog. Cold toddy ranks next in safety, then warm toddy, cold punch, and raw spirits. He adds, with respect to malt liquor, it is better to drink porter than strong ale, and advisable when accustomed to malt liquor to exercise, in order to avoid becoming fat and stupid and predisposed to apoplexy. For wine drinkers, the safest wines are, according to the same author, those possessed of the most diuretic properties, and which create the least headache and fever, as hock, claret, burgundy, bruxelles, and hermitage. Port, sherry, or Madeira, and sweet wines are apt to produce acid on weak stomachs. Claret is the most wholesome wine that is known. McNish also recommends not to drink of too many different kinds of wine at one sitting. The fact of intoxication being rapidly produced by mixtures of different wines is generally known, although usually disregarded when the temptation of a great variety of wines is offered to the guests at a dinner party. Hotel and tavern keepers, being frequently called upon to share the drink of their customers, are very liable to suffer from the variety of the beverages they consume. I have met with cases where individuals not only indulge in many different kinds of stimulants, but mix one liquor with another in the same glass, ale and gin, for example, being drunk together. Cider, and such wines as possess little spirit, and are more or less acid, are frequently, and with comparative safety, used in warm countries, and according to Roche may even prevent certain diseases, especially those resulting from a deficiency of the biliary secretion. Lehmann observes it is owing to cider's great cheapness that in several eastern cantons of Switzerland, such as Thurgovie, Appenzell, St. Gall, and Zurich, the results from the abuse of alcohol, so common in other cantons, are unknown. By consulting, as I have done, the medical practitioners in this country, one becomes convinced that cider is not attended with unfavorable effects, unless it be made from green fruit, or be ill prepared, or undergoing decomposition. There is no doubt, however, adds Roche, that the abuse of cider may become the source of disease. Delbecq states that cider does not agree with many people, producing frequently diarrhea and various forms of indigestion. Footnote: these sur influence des boissons alcooliques sur la santé, 1854, end footnote. We may observe that even wines of the same quality, bearing the same generic name, and grown in adjoining districts, do not act with equal power upon the brain. Thus I am informed by a gentleman who has had ample opportunities of making himself acquainted with the properties of Rhine wine, that the grapes grown in some adjoining districts along the Rhine do not produce wines equally heady. I believe many individuals will find that wine or beer does not exert the same action on their brain, as an equal quantity of a mixture of spirits and water, prepared so as to contain a proportion of alcohol similar to that which exists in the fermented juice of grape or in malt liquor. This circumstance may be accounted for by assuming that the alcohol of spirits, which is diluted, differs as to its influence on the brain from that of beer or wine, which is not distilled. At all events, we know positively that these two kinds of alcohol have not the same influence upon the sense of taste, for a wine connoisseur will be able to tell without difficulty whether distilled alcohol has been added to a sample of wine or whether the wine contains none but its natural alcohol. This fact showing that there is certainly a difference between the alcohol of distilled and that of non-distilled spirituous stimulants. Possibly, also, they are not with equal readiness removed from the body or decomposed therein. It is remarkable that distilled alcohol, added within certain proportions to port wine, is converted, after a lapse of some years, into the non-distilled kind, its presence being no longer discernible by the taste. Quantity taken. I had once an opportunity of overhearing a conversation between two laborers, the eldest, who appeared to have nearly reached the age of 70, and endeavoring to convince the other that the best way to attain old age was to drink freely of beer and spirits, and this, he observed, was a result of his own experience. It is certain that there are exceptions to the general rule that frequent excesses in alcoholic beverages will ultimately destroy health. These exceptions, however, are but very few. We must remember that the word excess is a case of intemperance, is not absolute, but to a certain degree relative, and that an allowance of spirituous beverage, all but harmless in one instance, might be attended with dangerous effects in another. The fact that some can indulge very freely in alcoholic drinks without suffering from them is illustrated by the following instance. J.M.B., age 49, a hawker, was engaged 30 years ago working in a distillery at Bristol, and during the 7 years he was thus employed used to drink rather less than a pint of gin daily. He travelled afterwards to Devonshire, where he drank a great deal of cider, from which he felt no further inconvenience than pain in the stomach and purging. For the last 4 months he has been taking 7 or 8 glasses of rum a day. He exhibits no symptom whatever of alcoholism, and applies to be treated merely for an eruption of acne on the face. It will be observed that most of my patients suffering from chronic alcoholism drank to a considerable extent both malt liquor and spirits. Thus, W.B., case 1, drank 1 pint of gin, and 2 or 3 and occasionally 6 or 8 pints of beer daily. E.C., case 15, took half a pint of brandy and 5 or 6 pints of stout daily. G.R., case 18, drank from 3 glasses to a pint of spirits daily, and 4 or 5 pints of ale. A very large amount of alcohol was taken by H.H., case 46, and T.D., case 47. The former, aged 42, contracted the habit of drinking when 14 or 15 years old, and from that time to the last 3 or 4 months has taken 3 or 4 pints of rum and as much beer daily. Footnote: this enormous quantity must be considered as an approximation to the truth. I cannot help thinking that the patient drank frequently less than his own statement might lead us to believe. End footnote. The latter, also aged 42, has taken for a period of 8 or 10 years an allowance of 10 small glasses of brandy, as much gin, and about 5 pints of beer daily. In some cases, a much smaller allowance of stimulants suffice to bring on a disordered state of the nervous system, as for example in that of G.J., case 14, who took 3 or 4 pints of beer daily and no spirits, and this man became intoxicated if he drank no more than 2 pints of ale at one sitting. The following case shows how remarkably liable some individuals are to suffer from a very small amount of alcoholic beverage. G.B., age 28, case 35, a stoker in the House of Parliament, admitted as an outpatient at Westminster Hospital on February 24, 1859, has always been of sober habits, and was only drunk once in his life when no more than 12 years of age. His daily allowance of beer has been 1 pint, and he has taken no spirits. 3 years ago he became a teetotaler because he found that even so little as 1 pint of beer daily did not agree with his health. He has been troubled with symptoms of chronic alcoholism for the last 3 years. Time the habit has been indulged. A very remarkable circumstance connected with chronic alcoholism is the fact of its occurring, or of the symptoms becoming frequently aggravated, long after the habit of drinking to excess has been given up, and even occasionally after complete abstinence for some time from alcoholic stimulants. As I am anxious to convince the reader of the truth of this statement, I shall perhaps be allowed to enter into the particulars of a case which illustrates it. T.C., age 35, a carpenter, has drunk hard during 10 years, taking from 6 to 10 pints of beer daily. During this time he has had several slight attacks of delirium tremens, and for 2 or 3 years suffered from chronic alcoholism, which induced him one day, about 6 years ago, to give up drinking entirely. He says he then became a teetotaler because drink did not agree with his health, making him nervous, giddy, and subject to trembling. He was restless at night, felt weak, his appetite was failing, and he was getting thinner and weaker. After adhering to total abstinence for a period of 6 months, he again returned to his former habit, although not to the same extent. On one occasion, however, he drank more than usual, and according to his own expression, became raving mad. During a day, not so much, however, from disturbance of the brain as from pain in the stomach. T.C. then determined upon giving up forever hard drinking, and since then, that is, for the last 2 years, has adhered to 2 pints of ale a day. Under this allowance his health greatly improved, the nervous uneasiness, giddiness, and trembling from which he had been suffering left him. Entirely ? Although his appetite remained deficient. 3 weeks ago, being much overworked and worried with family troubles, his health again gave way, although he positively states he did not then, or since assuming habits of sobriety, exceed his reduced allowance of beer. From that time he has suffered from a return of the old symptoms, namely nervous uneasiness, giddiness, and faintness, dimness of sight, and muscae volitantes, sleep disturbed by nightmare. For the last fortnight his strength has left him, so much so that 7 times he has been obliged to discontinue his work. He is a smoker, but has not smoked lately to a greater extent than previously. Much smoking does not agree with him. This case is an interesting illustration of symptoms of chronic alcoholism, occurring long after intemperate habits have been given up. I may also bring forward, as further examples, several cases reported elsewhere in this volume. Thus, C.A., Case 2, turned teetotaler 7 weeks before applying for relief at the Westminster Hospital. Gr. Case 18 drank from youth from 3 glasses of spirits to a pint, and 4 or 5 pints of ale daily, until about 11 months previous to admission, when he gave up completely both beer and spirits. C.P. Case 21 took 12 pints of beer daily for 9 years, but during the last 4 years drank only 2 or 3 pints of ale a day. Many other instances of the same kind will be found recorded in the table. Yet, notwithstanding their abstinence, these individuals fell a prey to past excesses. I have been led to observe that the injurious effects of long-continued abuse of alcoholic stimulants are frequently not developed to any extent until the occurrence of another circumstance, which is the immediate cause of the attack. It has not been possible for me to determine satisfactorily whether an attack of chronic alcoholism may supervene long after the individual has given up drinking, and without his having at all suffered from the nervous derangement known to result from frequent excesses. But this much may be safely stated, that in the great majority, if not in every case, the patient's constitution has been so far affected that the slightest cause will be sufficient to startle or frighten him, produce giddiness, headache, and keep him from sleeping at night, yet without preventing him from attending to his occupation, or proving of any material inconvenience. And such patients are very liable to a regular attack of chronic alcoholism from some cause independent of drink. Age. According to McNish, a child nursed by a drunken nurse is hardly ever healthy. It is especially subject to derangements of the digestive orders and to convulsive affections. Dr. North has observed this latter disease to be instantly arrested by transferring the child to a sober woman. McNish adds that the habit, in some parts of Scotland, of giving raw whiskey to babies a few days old turns them pallid, and they become emaciated, fretful, subject to convulsions, and every variety of disorders of the stomach, including vomiting and diarrhea, which may end in death. The following investigation undertaken by Dr. Hunter, reported by McNish and Carpenter, shows that alcoholic drinks, even in moderate quantities, do not agree with young children. He submitted to experiment his 2 children, both of them having been previously unused to wine. To the one, a child of 5 years old, he gave every day a full glass of sherry, and to the other, of nearly the same age, he gave an orange. In the course of a week, a very marked difference was perceptible in the pulse, urine, and evacuations from the bowels of the two children. The pulse of the first child was raised, the urine high-colored, and the evacuations destitute of their usual quantity of bile. In the other child no change whatever was produced. He then reversed the experiment, giving the first the orange, and to the second the wine, and the result was corresponded. The child who had an orange continued well, and the system of the other became straightway disordered, as in the first experiment. A young man betaking himself to the disgusting habit of drinking to excess may be considered as very liable to become intoxicated. Should his constitution not be strong and healthy, or should he not be accustomed to active habits, the first occurrence of disease may prove fatal, or, at all events, give him such warnings as will effectually prevent his returning to drink. But there are other young drunkards, gifted with strong and healthy constitutions and engaged in occupations requiring great muscular exertion in the open air, who are enabled to rid themselves rapidly of the alcoholic poisons. For instance, men employed as coal porters, hawkers, laborers, will be able to resist for many years the baneful consequences of intemperance. But at 41 years of age, those who have habitually indulged to excess in alcoholic liquors begin to suffer, probably because that is the time of life when youth and health often begin to depart. One individual becomes a prey to gout, another to rheumatism, another to pulmonary affections, and another to disorders of digestion. Now those very diseases are known to predispose greatly to chronic alcoholism, and it is therefore not to be wondered at that this disorder should usually make its appearance at the above-mentioned period. The youngest patient coming under my treatment for chronic alcoholism was 18 years old, and the oldest 75. Sex. Women appear to be much less subject to suffer from the long-continued abuse of alcoholic liquors than men. Indeed, I have only seen 4 or 5 cases of chronic alcoholism among the female sex. The following is a remarkably painful and interesting instance of chronic alcoholism, complicated with unmistakable symptoms of melancholia which occurred in women. Hearing I had given particular attention to the means of relieving the baneful effects of hard drinking, she called at the Westminster Hospital on the 16th of March, 1860, for the purpose of consulting me. She is 49 years old. Her father died at the age of 63, having been in a weak state of mind for the last even years of his life. Her mother was very subject to hysteria. She had a brother addicted to hard drinking. She was attacked with a nervous affection about 20 years ago, which lasted for 6 months, and left her odd and eccentric in her manners. Has enjoyed, however, since then very good health, and was a robust and cheerful woman up to the 20th of June, 1858. 3 or 4 years ago, and probably before that period, she contracted the habit of drinking, according to her own statement, about 3 half-quarterns of rum and 3 or 4 pints of beer daily. But after reading the details of this case, it will become evident that she took a great deal more. I have asked her why she first took to drinking, and she informed me that it was from keeping company with a young man who was a drunkard, and she was constantly in the society of people who spent their time in drinking. On the above-mentioned day in June 1858, a favorite cat this woman had kept for 14 years was stolen from her, and she was greatly distressed at this loss. The following night she fell ill. Her face and hands became swollen, and she was seized with great trembling throughout the whole body, crying and feeling very wretched. The following day, when going out into the street, she felt as if very drunk, not knowing what she was doing, and people appearing to her as if tumbling about. This was the beginning of an attack of delirium tremens, which lasted about a fortnight. On recovering, her intellect, memory, and other mental faculties had become completely blunted, and she continued subject to trembling, although, according to her statement, she then gave up hard drinking, taking no more ever since than a pint of beer daily. After this attack of delirium tremens, she often forgot the time of day, or did not know where she was. Everything looked dirty to her, and everybody ragged, and she no longer knew her former acquaintances. In the course of July 1859, she became very violent, breaking the crockery, tearing up the carpet, and destroying the china ornaments. This lasted about a week. She positively denies having been drinking previous to this attack, and cannot tell what brought it on. From that time she has been afflicted with symptoms of melancholia. there has been no return of morbid excitement. She is now in a wretched state of mental depression, and it appears to her as though she was alone in this world. At times she fancies her friends are pursuing her to place her in a madhouse, or according to her own expression, she feels as a figure moving about and acting mechanically. She is always wishing to do something, and if she takes some work in hand, she cannot manage it. Has but little sleep, and on awakening she does not know she has been asleep. She would give or do anything for a good night's rest. In the midst of tears and lamentations she exclaims, "Oh, sir, it is all through the horrid drink." She is subject to curious aberrations of the senses. She can neither smell nor taste, and her sight is much impaired. The tactile sensation is likewise blunted, and it seems to her as if she could not hold anything. Is much trouble with muscae volitantes. She has not been subject to headache, but to throbbing in the head and palpitations. Since the attack of delirium tremens, she attempted, on 2 occasions, to commit suicide with laudanum. One evening, when going to bed, she took 6 pennyworth, about 6 drachms, of laudanum at once, and kept it on the stomach for a whole night. It produced no sleep, but made her very giddy and faint. She vomited during the whole of the next day, and then recovered. I have not in my notes the particulars of the other attempt. She says she has taken a large quantity of laudanum as a medicament, which she believes to have done her a great deal of harm. Several nights in succession she has dosed herself with 1 or 2 pennyworths, about 1 or 2 drachms, of laudanum or black drop. I cannot dismiss this case without remarking that the abuse of alcohol is not the only cause of disease. There was obviously a strong predisposition to insanity, but from the history of the case, and the patient insisting so positively on her belief that drink was the cause of her illness, I feel assured the abuse of alcohol was the exciting cause of the attack, of which delirium tremens was the beginning. This case struck me as an interesting combination of chronic alcoholism and melancholia. Magnus Huss accounts for his having met with but few cases of chronic alcoholism among females, by assuming not that the male sex are more predisposed to alcoholism than women, but that men indulge in alcoholic liquors more than women. Of 139 patients treated by Huss during 3 years, there were 123 men and 16 women. It is well known that delirium tremens is not frequent among females. Roche states that in his opinion this phenomenon is not owing to the circumstance that fewer women drink than men, for the disproportion is too considerable not to depend upon other causes. In 170 cases of delirium tremens observed by Reyer, there were only 7 females affected. Bang, at Copenhagen, only observed 10 among 456 patients. Hugh and Goldberg only noticed 1 case in 173. Kruger, Hausen, 1 in 16, and the directors of the hospital at Christiania, 1 in 11. Temperament. It would be very interesting to determine precisely the influence of temperament as a predisposing cause of chronic alcoholism. This object, however, will be very difficult to attain, because such patients have invariably a nervous constitution from the effects of alcohol when they apply for relief, and it is not easy to ascertain their temperament previous to their taking to intemperate habits. Whatever be the influence of this predisposing cause, there is no doubt that those who enjoy a sound constitution and a strong health are much less liable to suffer from chronic alcoholism than others, and vice versa. According to Delbeck, the more plethoric and sanguine the temperament, the more the nervous system is irritable, and subject to suffer from alcohol. Individuals having a lymphatic temperament being better able to stand spirituous beverages. Magnus Huss expresses a similar opinion. He classifies the different temperaments as follows according to their degree of influence in predisposing to chronic alcoholism. First, the sanguine temperament. Second, the phlegmatic. 3, the bilious. 4th, the lymphatic. 5th, the nervous. Habits. The habits of an individual are among the most important of the causes predisposing to chronic alcoholism. As a general rule, habits of indolence and idleness, independently of their acting as a strong inducement to drink, favor slow poisoning by alcohol. Where the disorder is limited to the mildest symptoms, I have repeatedly observed it to be checked in a remarkable degree by having recourse to exercise of the mind and body, and I have noticed individuals accustomed to hard work becoming affected with symptoms owing to past excesses, because they had no longer any work to do. Smoking tobacco. Tobacco, more especially that of the strongest kind, undoubtedly predisposes the nervous system to suffer from the long-continued abuse of spirituous drinks, an observation which is not without importance and interest, considering that the habit of drinking is frequently accompanied by that of smoking. If it be remembered that the poisoning by tobacco fumes is attended with giddiness, trembling, and other symptoms referable to a disordered condition of the nervous system, it will obviously follow that the habit of smoking, and especially of smoking to excess, will act conjointly with that of drinking in bringing on an attack of chronic alcoholism. The following are a few cases illustrating this fact. H.E., case 33, a clerk admitted on the 21st of February, 1859. Drank at Christmas last a considerable amount of ale and gin, and has been in bad health since that time, suffering from trembling in the morning, weakness, and loss of memory, and has lately been unable to sleep at night. This patient had contracted the habit of smoking a great deal of shag tobacco, to which circumstance he himself partly ascribes his illness. E.C., case 15, 6 years ago took to the habit of drinking about half a pint of brandy daily, and 5 or 6 pints of stout. After keeping up this allowance for nearly 4 years, he reduced it to 8 pints of porter daily, and continued with that amount up to the time of his admission on the 16th of December, 1853. He has suffered from the last 4 years from chronic alcoholism, one of the symptoms being trembling in the morning, especially when he has drunk freely the evening before. He states that he has been a hard smoker and has observed that smoking increased the trembling. A.P., case 41, Act 40, a gas fitter, admitted on the 21st March, 1859, had been in the habit of drinking for the last 2 or 3 years 6 or 7 pints of beer daily. 6 or 7 months ago he began to exhibit the symptoms of chronic alcoholism. About 6 weeks previous to admission, when smoking 3 quarts of an ounce of tobacco per day, he suddenly became worse, his nervous system having evidently been much affected by the use of tobacco. The habit of smoking being one so prevalent among those who are fond of alcoholic stimulants, and its effect being so directly connected with the slow poisoning from alcoholic beverages, an inquiry into this subject will not be out of place on the present occasion. It is difficult to conceive why boys take so much pleasure in smoking cigars or a pipe, when out of sight of their parents or guardians, but vanity and pride probably here act a prominent part. Children desire to imitate their elders, and show each other they can color a pipe or smoke a cigar to the very end, even if they have to pay the penalty of nausea and vomiting. Thus the individual contracts a pernicious habit, which he will find extreme difficulty in breaking off, if obliged to do so in after life. When smoking is becoming a habit, it gradually ceases to cause sickness, although still occasionally nausea and giddiness, and finally the nausea and giddiness disappear, returning only on special occasions. It is then that tobacco smoking produces such pleasurable sensations as those resulting from the narcoticism of opium, when the imagination changes each successful puff of smoke into every description of fanciful objects, when the bachelor forgets his solitude, the mind its troubles, and the body its pains. A painful impression on the mind is certainly soothed by smoking, and this is a frequent cause of the habit being contracted. One man will take to smoking to drown the disappointment of unsuccessful labors, and another to allay the affliction from the loss of a friend. * Smoking appears to have the property of diminishing the power of mental abstraction. It is probably on this account that when the mind is haunted by some painful idea, the act of smoking assists the effort of the will to dismiss it. Smoking is also a frequent habit among those who are called upon to exercise much mental exertion, because it appears to possess the power of resting the mind when tired. When the body and mind are excited, and it is usually the case after dinner, or post pocula, or in a convivial meeting of friends, smoking is often resorted to as an instinctive means of keeping the excitement within certain limits. The very prevalent habit of smoking after dinner must have for its principal object that of allaying the discomfort arising from the stimulating action of the meal. At dinner, a glass of sherry Madeira immediately follows the soup, these, along with port, being our strongest wines. At first sight, it does not appear rational to commence with the strongest wine, which must necessarily impair more or less the taste and stimulating effects of the weaker, such as claret and burgundy, that may follow. But it is found agreeable to begin by exciting the appetite with a powerful stimulant, The more alcoholic the beverage, the better it answers the purpose, so much so that some are not satisfied with sherry after the soup, but begin dinner with a glass of spirits. The stomach is thus induced to take more than is required, and after dinner a sensation of fullness is felt, which is conveniently relived by a cup of strong coffee. But now an uneasy feeling of heat and excitement is experienced, from which the body partly recovers by means of a full-flavored cigar pipe. Finally, it is remarkable how much certain individuals can smoke on special occasions without its producing giddiness or sickness, or any unpleasant feeling, the same persons being in general easily affected by alcohol. In all cases where the body and mind are excited within certain limits, smoking will be most easily tolerated, as for example after dinner, during the excitement from eating and drinking, in a party attended with the enjoyment of conversation, or a sporting excursion, when under the influence of sport and exercise, and the stimulating power of open air. I may perhaps be allowed to conclude these observations by advising young men, whatever may be their position in life, not to take to smoking, as such habit is certainly not conducive to health. To adults of a sound constitution who have contracted the habit of smoking to a moderate extent, and do not feel worse for it, I would recommend to smoke only after a meal, and that but seldom.
Occupation. Such occupations will exhaust the body, from their requiring great muscular exercise, especially when carried on indoors, favor the early development of chronic alcoholism, and occasionally, in these instances, a very small proportion of alcoholic beverage will be hurtful. Thus, individuals obliged to work hard in a confined place, before a blazing fire, as stokers on board steamers or in factories, are very liable to suffer from spirituous stimulants. The reader will, perhaps, remember the case of J.B., case 35, a stoker in the House of Parliament, who at the early age of 23 labored under chronic alcoholic intoxication. T.S. Case 3, an engineer on board a steamer, consulted me for chronic alcoholism at the age of 33. He had suffered previously from several attacks of delirium tremens. I have already recorded the case of an engine driver contracting chronic alcoholism at 56. His immunity arising probably from a very robust state of health. The average age of these three cases is 37, while that of 47 patients whose ages have been reported in the synoptical table is 41. Trades affording very little or no exercise of the mind or body predispose also to suffer early, and consequently when young, from the habit of drinking. Thus, clerks, tailors, and other tradesmen, cab and cart drivers, are very liable to disorders of the nervous system arising from intemperance. The table of cases appended to this work shows the truth of the foregoing observation. E.B. Case 9, a tailor age 41, G.R. Case 18, general dealer age 38, G.M. Case 19, cushion maker age 33, W.F. Case 24, a carter age 34, J.H. Case 25, a shoemaker at 27, W.P. Case 26, a cabman age 29, H.E. Case 33, a clerk age 24. There are, however, 2 instances reported of individuals of sedentary occupation suffering from chronic alcoholism at an advanced age. W.J. Case 5, a shoemaker age 75, N.D.V. Case 27, greengrocer age 72. And if, reckoning the last 2 cases as exceptional, we take the average age of the patients of this class, we shall find it to be 32, whilst the average age of 47 patients is 41. Other occupations requiring much exercise in the open air also furnish our hospitals with a great number of cases of chronic alcoholic intoxication, but these individuals are not affected so young as those previously mentioned, their average age being 39, showing that, although much addicted to drinking, they are not particularly liable to suffer from chronic alcoholism. I allude especially to laborers, coal porters, sailors, hawkers, and carriers. There is no doubt but that in the higher class of society, a great number of cases of chronic alcoholism may be observed, although the disease is certainly most prevalent among those who attend our hospitals. Dr. Budd, alluding to the indigestion of drunkards connected with symptoms of chronic alcoholism, observes, Footnote: Dr. Budd, on the organic diseases and functional disorders of the stomach, page 290, end footnote. The kind of disorder we are considering is now seldom met with, except in the lower ranks of life. Half a century ago, hard drinking was common in the upper classes, and men of fortune were often sent to Bath, to restore the tone of their stomach by drinking of its waters. It is true that intoxication is now very seldom met with the upper classes of society, but from the disposition of many to suffer from alcohol taken even in comparatively moderate quantity, there must still exist a great number of individuals in comfortable as well as wealthy circumstances, whose nervous system becomes affected from the effects of long-continued habit of drinking wine or spirits. Circumstances connected with the food taken. In addition to the above, there are other circumstances which appear to increase to a considerable extent the tendency of alcoholic drinks to produce chronic alcoholic intoxication, namely drinking early in the morning before breakfast, and consequently on an empty stomach, and living on a spare, solid diet, in the latter case the beverage constituting nearly the whole of the food taken. It is a prevalent habit for laborers in some parts of the country to sleep in the tap rooms of public houses where they have a free night's lodging, and it is an interesting sight to see such work-worn individuals lying about in winter near the fireside, on the floor, tables and benches, and enjoying as complete a rest as if they were in a comfortable bed. Early in the morning they awake, and most of them begin with beer or spirits, commodities within their immediate reach, which they suppose will give them an appetite for breakfast, and keep out of the cold for the whole day. During the week they are called out in the fields, and must leave the table, but on Sunday these same men continue drinking from morning to evening, taking very little food, and as early as 9 or 10 o'clock a.m. symptoms of drunkenness in the tap room may be observed. I have no doubt that with many laborers the morning dram on an empty stomach is the cause of their suffering, sooner or later, from chronic alcoholism. There is a class of men whose only nourishment for days in succession is beer. I allude more particularly to those who are employed in breweries. The stomach of these individuals becomes filled with nothing but beer, which must be absorbed with a much greater rapidity than during the normal process of digestion, when fluids taken as beverages become immediately mixed up with the food. And it is in no degree remarkable that this constant passage of alcohol from the stomach into the blood and brain should give rise to cerebral symptoms. Moreover, the appetite of such men for solid food is quickly blunted, not only on account of the physiological fact that alcohol diminishes the waste of the body, see appendix, and consequently its requirement for new materials, but more especially, as I have already remarked, when alluding to the influence of alcohol on health, from the long continued action of the fluid on the nerves and lining membrane of the stomach. This morbid state of the organs of digestion, by depressing the general standard of health, and by preventing the body from taking the amount of food required for its healthy nutrition, predisposes greatly to chronic alcoholism. End of section 3.
Section 4 of On Chronic Alcoholic Intoxication, with an inquiry into the influence of the abuse of alcohol as a predisposing cause of disease, by William Marcet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Immediate causes of an attack of chronic alcoholic intoxication. A question of great practical importance now suggests itself to our notice. What is the nature of the last and immediate cause which determines an outbreak of the disease? This question is one very difficult to answer, for in many cases the disorder creeps on slowly, under the influence of predisposing causes, so that when the urgency of symptoms obliges the sufferer to have recourse to medical advice, he cannot state precisely the time when the illness began, neither can he ascribe it to any particular cause, except that of intemperance. The usual expression of such patients is, that drink does not agree with them, and under these circumstances many drop the habit entirely or greatly diminish their allowance. In the case of C.P., case 21, no other immediate cause of the illness could be detected than hard drinking. He had fallen ill 4 years before admission, and during the preceding 9 years had been in the habit of taking no less than about 12 pints of beer daily. An exceptional excess. An attack of chronic alcoholism will frequently be determined suddenly by an exceptional excess or a severe fit of drunkenness. Thus, for instance, J.W., case 11, aged 18,
after drinking all day from 10 in the morning to 12 at night, was suddenly seized next morning with symptoms of chronic alcoholism. J.F. footnote, not reported in the table from want of completeness of notes, end footnote, admitted on the 10th of January, 1859, committed an extraordinary excess during 3 days, at Christmas last, when he took 6 or 7 quarterns of raw gin and about 3 pints of beer daily, after which he suffered from chronic alcoholism. He is not an habitual drunkard, and takes usually a pint of beer daily. W.P. case 26, 2 nights previous to falling ill, indulged more than usual, and was drunk. B.L. case 36, admitted on the 28th February, 1859, was attacked with chronic alcoholism 4 years ago, but is worse now than previously from drinking at Christmas last more than his usual allowance. Coexisting disease. An attack of chronic alcoholic intoxication is frequently brought on by another disease, whether this disease be produced directly by excessive drinking, or whether it be apparently quite independent of intemperate habits. The same observation applies to delirium tremens, a disease very closely allied to chronic alcoholism. We read in the Treatise of Roche, an individual in the habit of drinking to excess, affected by a chronic or acute disease, which cannot be attributed directly to intemperance, often suffers from peculiar symptoms, and the alcoholic poisoning which had remained latent breaks forth suddenly. Thus, when drunkards become affected with inflammation of the lungs, they are very liable to delirium tremens. In one case, Roche has observed the disease to be brought on by very painful attacks of rheumatism. Dr. Schmidt, at the General Hospital of Hamburg, has seldom seen a perfectly genuine case of delirium tremens. This affection appeared to him to be brought on usually by powerful emotions, external lesions, and inflammations, especially of the chest or lungs. He reports that Channing states, having met with delirium tremens, attended 6 times out of 7 with an affection of the chest or lungs. The habit of drinking may therefore occasionally be indulged in with impunity, until the occurrence of some affection of the lungs, rheumatism, or other illness causes the appearance of those symptoms directly referable to the abuse of alcoholic stimulants. The 2 following cases, where chronic alcoholism is brought on by attacks of gout, are well calculated to illustrate the truth of the foregoing observation. T.D. Case 47, a cab driver, age 42, admitted on the 25th of April, 1857. He began drinking 5 or 6 pints of ale daily, which kept up for upwards of 5 years. Since that time he increased his allowance to 10 small glasses of brandy, as much gin, and about 5 pints of ale daily. He went on taking this large quantity of ale and spirits for 8 or 10 years, being none the worse for his intemperance, until he was seized with gout 2 years before admission. The disease lasted a fortnight, and was followed by a severe attack of chronic alcoholism, from which he has suffered ever since. D.B. Case 27, a greengrocer, aged 72, admitted as outpatient on January 17, 1859, took to the habit of drinking to excess when a young man, his average allowance being 4 or 5 glasses of spirits and 3 or 4 pints of beer daily. But for the last 14 or 15 years he has given up hard drinking and reduced the amount to a pint of beer daily and an occasional glass of spirits. On rising in the morning he trembles a great deal for rather less than half an hour, perceives occasionally imaginary objects, and a mist forms at times before his eyes, hears absent people addressing him, does not complain of headache or giddiness, has very little sleep, partly from the disturbance of the nervous system, partly on account of the pain he is suffering. According to his own expression, night after night he lies awake in the greatest agony, frequently suffers from sickness and vomiting. These various symptoms have assumed an intermittent form, lasting for a month, and occurring at intervals of about a week. The patient suffers, moreover, from gout, as will be seen from the following additional statement. There is considerable pain in the ankles, knees, and hands. The thumb of the right hand is now greatly thickened. He feels an acute pain in the great toes of both feet, and can only walk with the assistance of a stick. These symptoms invariably occur with those of chronic alcoholism. As soon as the attack of gout passes off, the patient also becomes free from the other disease, and as often as the gout returns, the nervous system is again affected. In this case, therefore, the occurrence of gout was obviously the immediate cause of the attack of chronic alcoholism. I have had opportunities of observing a similar effect resulting from rheumatism, affections of the lungs, and gastritis.
Although the poisonous action of alcohol is often developed by the occurrence of another disease, chronic alcoholism, it may be observed, is sometimes accompanied by a secondary disorder, which it is difficult to connect with the outbreak of the former, and, moreover, the morbid condition of the nervous system, owing to long-continued intemperance, is not unfrequently concealed by the coexistence of another disorder, exhibiting symptoms of a more prominent and decided character. I need not insist on the importance of making, in these cases, a correct and complete diagnosis. A glance at the synoptical table will show the tendency of bronchitis to accompany chronic alcoholism. For instance, J.H., case 20, suffering from chronic alcoholism, is attacked every winter with bronchitis. J.R., case 23, admitted at first for bronchitis, to which he has been subject for several years, but it was found subsequently he also labored under chronic alcoholic intoxication. J.H., case 25, was treated at first for bronchitis. Shortly after his admission, it was discovered he was suffering from chronic alcoholism. Affections of the stomach are so frequently the result of excessive drinking that it is difficult to determine whether they are actually the cause which determines the outbreak of chronic alcoholism or constitute merely a coexisting disease. Dr. Bug gives us the following correct and interesting account of the disorder of the stomach so frequently met with in drunkards. The chief characters of this indigestion of drunkards are want of appetite and vomiting or dry retching in the morning, with a white or furred tongue and a slow pulse. The power of digestion is much enfeebled, and if the patient eat at any time, what for others would be a very moderate meal, is apt to vomit soon afterwards, and to be troubled with pain and flatulence. This disorder, like the vice from which it springs, is most frequent in men of middle age, and is generally associated with more or less that of strange, peculiar disturbance of the nervous system which hard drinking brings on, and of which the most striking effects are inability to sleep, or sleep broken by frightful dreams, despondency in the morning, and tremulousness of the hands and tongue. I have also asked my patients whether the loss of appetite, pain in the stomach, and vomiting preceded the appearance of the nervous symptoms, but have very seldom obtained a perfectly precise and satisfactory answer. Opportunities have, however, offered for my observing that an increase of the morbid condition of the digestive organs may be attended with a marked progress of the disturbance of the nervous system, and that an improvement of the digestion may be accompanied with a diminution of the nervous symptoms. A glance at the accompanying table will show the frequency of disordered digestion in cases of chronic alcoholic intoxication. J.T., case 13, complains of pain in the stomach as soon as he has eaten or drunk. L.M., case 17, on falling ill first complained of the pain in the stomach after taking food, and restlessness at night. W.F., case 24, suffers from pain in the stomach and sickness, increasing after taking food. W.P., case 26, complains of pain in the stomach increased by eating. D.W., case 28, has lost his appetite and feels sick in the morning. B.L., case 36, appetite deficient, great pain in the stomach after eating. Cerebral concussions. I have met with an instance of chronic alcoholism suddenly occasioned by a fall, producing at the time cerebral concussion. This case was that of A.P., case 41, a gas fitter in the habit of drinking 6 or 7 pints of beer daily for the last 2 or 3 years. 6 or 7 months previous to admission, being then in perfect health, he fell from a height of 25 feet. The fall must have been attended with cerebral concussion, as he stated that his nerves appeared to have been shaken. From that time he began to suffer from symptoms of chronic alcoholism, which were subsequently increased by smoking. On admission he complains of want of sleep, with wandering of the mind and giddiness, trembles and feels sick in the morning, has no appetite, and suffers from pain in the stomach. I beg to remind the reader that the symptoms of the cerebral concussion and of drunkenness are very much alike, and if it be admitted that a fit of intoxication is frequently the immediate cause of an attack of chronic alcoholism, a similar result may be expected from cerebral concussion. The analogy between the symptoms of drunkenness and cerebral concussion has been observed by Sir Benjamin Brodie. Footnote: Philosophical Transactions for 1811, page 181. End footnote. He states, concussion of the brain, which may be considered as the slightest degree of injury, occasions a state of mind resembling intoxication, and the resemblance in some instances is so complete that the most accurate observer cannot form a diagnosis except from the history of the case.
It may be stated, I believe, as a general rule, that any disease affecting subjects given to drinking will, by weakening the body, more fully expose the nervous system to suffer from intemperate habits. End of section 4.
Section 5 of On Chronic Alcoholic Intoxication, with an inquiry into the influence of the abuse of alcohol as a predisposing cause of disease by William Marcet. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Affections of the nervous system resembling chronic alcoholic intoxication. There exist certain disorders of the functions of the nervous system owing to other causes than intemperance, and closely resembling chronic alcoholism. They are produced by long-continued and excessive intellectual exertions, and by sudden and violent emotions. These affections exhibit symptoms which bear a close analogy to those of chronic alcoholism, and I have treated them successfully by the same means. I have preserved notes relating to several patients who suffered from disorders of the nervous system owing to excessive mental exertions, the principal symptoms being headache and giddiness, with much nervous uneasiness and sometimes hallucination, want of sleep, and occasional palpitations. In 1854 I attended Mrs. B., aged 24. For the last 3 months she had been greatly engaged with literary pursuits, and ascribed her illness to excessive reading and exertion of the mind. She suffers from headache, giddiness, and great nervous uneasiness. She cannot sleep at night, her appetite is indifferent, and she is subject now and then to palpitations. The following is a remarkable case which came under my notice, where the disturbance of the nervous system from excessive mental exertion and anxiety had reached such a pitch as to amount to actual mental alienation. C.T., age 41, as a gas rate collector, apparently in easy circumstances, of a very nervous temperament and excitable temper. He had always been a gas inspector, and subject to much anxiety connected with his business. There exists a slight tendency to suicide, but he observes that he never would or could destroy himself. He is accompanied by his wife, who considers all he says as the perfect truth. C.T. expresses himself fluently, and his memory appears very lucid, from the minute account he gives of his case. On September 13, 1855, he was engaged the whole day in writing, and appeared much excited. He went to bed at 11 o'clock, and the next morning rose at 3. At 9 a.m. he proceeded to his business, leaving his papers in great disorder, which he had never done before. He returned home at 5 p.m. and asked for some tea. Having shortly afterwards kissed his children, his wife was then absent, he left home, though for no definite purpose, taking a few pounds with him. He wandered about all night, and found himself in the morning at Hampton Court. He continued walking, not knowing where he was going, or why he had left his house, and after some days arrived at Southampton. He next embarked on a packet leaving for France, and resumed his rambles in Normandy, where he suffered great privations, sleeping in the fields and on the high road, and living upon nothing but turnips, apples, and water. Having remained abroad for about 1 month, at the commencement of November he returned to Plymouth, stopping on his way at Jersey, and then wandered to Teignmouth, Totnes, Exeter, and from thence to Bristol and Clifton. He still had some money with him, although he thought he had none, and that he wanted none, with the view of joining his family on the birthday of one of his children. This unfortunate man returned home, and arrived late at night at his own door. The person who opened it unluckily did not recognize him, and closed the door upon him. He then set off again on his rambling life, and walked to Brighton, with the object of visiting some relations who he knew would be kind to him. But when at Brighton he never called upon them, although he passed under their very windows. He does not know why he did not see them. From Brighton he went to Shoreham, to Worthing, and to Preston, where his money being entirely spent, and having no food, he began to suffer the most bitter pangs of hunger. He used his utmost endeavours to obtain food from charitable institutions, and was directed to Arundel, whence, finding no relief, he proceeded to Chichester. In this town his sufferings from hunger were such that he was induced to produce food by dishonest means. He was taken up and imprisoned, with hard labour, for 12 days. When liberated he immediately started for London, where he walked in 2 days, the distance being 64 miles. During the journey he took nothing but bread and water. He proceeded immediately to his house, and arrived there on the 27th November, having been absent from home more than 2 months.
It was not until this patient had been thoroughly cross-questioned that I could believe the foregoing account. In order to obtain a corroborative evidence, I examined his naked feet and found the soles hardened, resembling tough leather, and showing that he certainly walked a considerable distance. This patient called on me in April 1861. He was quite well and engaged in an active and responsible situation. His health had been perfectly sound since he had left off my treatment, which he gratefully acknowledged. Sudden grief may produce symptoms identical with those of chronic alcoholism. Indeed, in the following case, I was with some difficulty convinced that the patient was not addicted to the habit of excessive drinking. R.M., a coal porter, admitted as an outpatient on March 10, 1859, is of regular habits, and has never been addicted to drinking, has not been more than twice in his life the worse for liquor. Lost his wife 8 months ago, at which he was greatly distressed, and since then suffered from the frequent occurrence of giddiness, headache, and black specks before his eyes. He trembles a great deal, especially in the morning, cannot sleep well at night, but his sleep is not disturbed by nightmare. Is very weak, yet has not given up work. Has smoked a great deal after the death of his wife, for the purpose, he says, of driving care away. He now perceives that smoking makes him very giddy, and he is gradually giving up the habit. There are other diseases exhibiting the symptoms in common with chronic alcoholism, such as chorea, hysteria, the sequel of an attack of apoplexy, and tremors from poisoning with lead or mercury, but it would be inconsistent with our subject to enter upon any observations on these affections. Prognosis. As may be anticipated, the successful treatment of chronic alcoholism depends, first of all, on the habit of drinking to excess being given up. As soon as this result is obtained, or if the patient applies for relief, after having, of his own accord, ceased drinking, a favorable issue of the disease is to be expected. In those instances where the complaint is attended with other disorders, and if the patient be not in reduced circumstances, the treatment is very successful, the sufferer being cured of every symptom. The weakness of the limbs, so prevalent in the disease, is sometimes, however, troublesome to overcome entirely. But in cases where the disorder of the nervous system, consequent on intemperance, is accompanied by another disease, the treatment may have to be continued for some length of time, and will sometimes leave the patient still laboring under the secondary affection. A remarkable instance of this kind, which has already been alluded to, was that of an individual subject to gout, and who was seized with chronic alcoholism at every successive return of the gouty attacks. He was treated for chronic alcoholism, and gradually the symptoms of the morbid condition of the nervous system disappeared, although the attacks of gout returned. Disease of the liver appeared in one instance to keep up chronic alcoholism, although in the course of the treatment a marked improvement of the nervous symptoms was obtained. Inflammation of the lungs also increases the difficulty of arresting and curing the disease. The same observation applies to disorders of the digestive organs and rheumatic affections. It must be also understood that an improvement in the secondary disease is usually attended with the relief of chronic alcoholism. End of section 5.